The next thing we'll talk about here is just major economic events and their impacts. So, there are a few things I'll talk about here. There are four. The first one is the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. So the USD was no longer pegged to the amount of gold that they have in the reserve. And so back then, a lot of nations subscribed to the Bretton Woods system. So a lot of nations pegged the currency to the gold that exists. Um, because I think the US wanted to fund the Vietnam War, and because the US was just printing a lot of money, what Nixon did was that he just shocked the economy by taking it away from the Bretton Woods system and making the currency floating. So when your currency is floating, it means that its value is determined via supply demand on the foreign exchange market. So we know this as forex, which is why you see like drastic shift in the value of a currency during like very big economic event. So I think that gold doesn't change that. So if you're pegged to the gold, it doesn't matter whether or not your economy is like in a crisis or whatever, the fact that the gold exists and the fact that your currency is pegged to the gold means that you get less fluctuation in the value of your currency. But if this is determined by supply and demand, where people feel that your currency might be worthless or worth a lot in the span of a few days, it might also just lead to these things becoming very, very volatile. The two best example of this is the Russian ruble. So during the Russo-Ukraine conflict, there were increased sanctions that led to the collapse of the ruble. Another one is I think the Turkish lira. So the Turkish lira has also just been not very like profitable a few days. So if I go and exchange my Malaysian ringgit for the Turkish lira, I can spend a lot more in Turkey right now. The next one is the Colombian exchange. This one is less modern and more historical. So this was just the widespread transfer of goods between the Americas and the rest of the world. So these are goods like waves, like maize and like wheat, turkey, cattle. But this were also diseases. So like a lot of smallpox and whatever were carried over to Europe and like syphilis was carried over from the new world to the old world. So that also just led to a transfer of diseases that people were not prepared for. Um, this was also like the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade because people are like, well, if I can cultivate a lot of agricultural goods and sell them, I might as well have my slaves do those work for me. And that also began the Atlantic slave trade. Two more. The next one is the Eurozone debt crisis. A lot of European nations had way too much debt they could not pay back. They were just using that money in ways that are unproductive, in ways that did not really benefit the economy, either in mega projects that were not very beneficial, or in spending for or excessive spending in welfare that people cannot see becoming economically profitable in the long term. So they were forced to default. This led to the diabolical loop where when the debt increased, investors are scared and they pull out the money from the bank risks insolvency, and the state wouldn't have to bail them out. When you bail them out, the debt increases and you create the cycle. And what happened here was that many states were forced to adopt like austerity measures. We'll talk about that later on. The last one is the '08 financial crisis. This was partly not so. This wasn't because like real estate was like a big new thing. Like people own and have houses, but it was a narrative of home ownership coupled alongside the fact that the economy was just severely deregulated back then. You were able to just obtain a loan for very low interest rate, which led to a lot of people borrowing money and investing in the housing bubble. A lot of corporations also rely on this thing called collateralized debt obligation to hide the fact that they have very low credit rating to borrow more money. So basically, they just clump up a lot of the debt they have together and say, we have all this debt, we are pretty reliable, and they obtain a credit of AAA, and that led to them being able to just get a lot more money. That money now goes into the housing market in the process. It also just didn't have a lot of rating agencies are just very corrupt and very like inefficient in the way that they properly evaluate a lot of these things, which is why we have a lot more regulation over these things right now.